Hey guys, so today I wanted to talk to you guys about covalent and ionic bonds. So I think a lot of us have heard of these two kinds of bonds. I mean, if you take in middle school science, you would probably know that most molecules are bonded by either covalent bonds or ionic bonds. But I wanted to talk about what these bonds are and how they're different from each other. And I think most importantly, it's how we can distinguish these two kinds of bonds. I was really confused by this in middle school, and I just wanted to explain to you guys about how to distinguish these kinds of bonds. So I think a lot of times teachers teach this concept by saying that, well, for an ionic bond, you have an electron that is completely transferred over to your other atom. And this makes it so that the atom with the electron is negatively charged, and the atom that gave up its electron will be positively charged, and then they're attracted to each other. And for a covalent bond, I think most teachers will probably say that, well, they're kind of like sharing this electron, and that's what make them bonded together. And I think, well, that is a good general explanation of these two bonds, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. So the complication with the definition that's given by most middle school teachers is that there's no difference between an ionic and a covalent bond. They're literally using the same forces to bind your atoms together into molecules. So why do we distinct them into two kinds? Well, you see, how atoms bind together is by this tug of war. They're fighting over this electron. And in an ionic compound, we typically say that one atom is so much stronger than the other atom in this electron tug of war that basically your electron is transferred over. So that's why we call it an ionic compound. And for a covalent one, well, they're kind of tied up in this tug of war. So we say that they're sharing this electron. So that's why we call them covalent compounds. So the sure way to tell apart these kinds of bonds is by looking at the atom's electronegativities. So the electronegativity is basically a number indicating how strongly your atom is pulling at the electrons. And the higher the number, basically the stronger the atom is. And we can look at two atoms in a bond and find the difference between their electronegativities. And when your electronegativity is very small, something maybe like 0.4, then it's going to be pretty equal in strength. They're going to be sharing the electron. So we consider anything lower than 0.4 to be a covalent bond. But if your two atoms' electronegativities are very, very far apart, something like 1.8 and above, then we say that the stronger atom will be holding the electron, and that's why we consider those kinds of bonds to be ionic bonds. By the way, so all of the bonds that are made with two atoms that have electronegativity differences of 0.4 to 1.8 are actually technically a third kind of bond called polar covalent bonds, but most people will just say that it's a covalent bond, so technically there's three kinds of bonds. While looking at the electronegativities works great, I'm sure you're not gonna always carry around that table. So one thing that you can do is to actually just look at what kinds of atoms is in this molecule. And if your bond is between a metal atom and a non-metal atom, then they're usually gonna be ionic. And if your bond is between two non-metal atoms, then there's a high probability that it's going to be covalent. And I think that method actually works great on most middle school and high school questions. So there you go.